During a tense live television interview, a liberal host confronts newly appointed U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio with a biting remark, "Aren't you ashamed of being a puppet for that man?" Referring to President Donald Trump. Without hesitation, Rubio fires back with a sharp response that not only silences the host, but leaves the entire studio in shock. His no-nonsense comeback is making waves across social media. Watch the moment that has everyone talking. The bright studio lights cast a sharp glow over the sleek, modern set. A red live sign blinked in the corner of the screen, signaling that millions were watching. Across the table sat Marco Rubio, the newly appointed U.S. Secretary of State. His suit crisp, his expression unreadable. He was a man prepared for anything, so he thought. Facing him was the fiery television host, known for her relentless questioning. Her nails tapped against the desk as she leaned forward, her eyes burning with intensity. Then she struck. "Aren't you ashamed of being a puppet for that man?" Silence. The air in the room seemed to freeze. The audience held their breath, and even the camera crew exchanged nervous glances. The insult hung in the air like a dagger, its weight pressing down on everyone. For a moment, Marco didn't move. His fingers rested lightly on the table, his face unreadable. Then he lifted his head, his sharp, unwavering eyes locking onto hers. What happened next would change everything. Marco Rubio took a slow, deliberate breath. The room was silent, the tension unbearable. Then, with the calmness of a man who had walked through fire before, he leaned slightly forward. "A puppet?" he repeated, his voice smooth but laced with something dangerous. "Tell me, was it a puppet who grew up watching his immigrant parents struggle to put food on the table? Was it a puppet who worked hard not because it was easy, but because the American dream isn't just a slogan, it's my story?" The host blinked. She hadn't expected this. Marco continued, his voice unwavering. "You call me a puppet for serving my country? You sit there behind your desk, judging me, while men and women in uniform put their lives on the line every day. I stand with them. I serve them. And yes, I serve the president as his puppet, but as the voice of the people who elected him." Gasps filled the studio. The cameraman swallowed hard. Even the sound crew, hidden behind their equipment, sat frozen. The host opened her mouth, but no words came out. The tides had shifted, and the world was watching. The clip of Marco's response spread like wildfire. Within minutes, it was all over social media. Millions of Americans sat in their living rooms, eyes glued to their screens, hearts pounding. People who had never cared about politics before found themselves wiping their faces. Veterans gripped their chests. Immigrants, workers, family, all of them felt it. Marco wasn't just answering a question, he was speaking for them. In a small diner in Florida, an elderly Cuban man, his hands trembling from years of hard labor, whispered, "He speaks for us." On a military base, a soldier about to be deployed clenched his jaw and muttered, "That's leadership." In a crowded bus, a mother trying to make ends meet wiped away a tear. "He gets it," she murmured. And in the television studio, the host sat in stunned silence. For the first time in her career, she had no words. Marco Rubio had not just won the interview, had won the heart of America. The studio was dead silent. The host sat frozen, her carefully prepared notes forgotten. She had expected a defense from Rubio, maybe a hesitant politician struggling to distance himself from the president. But this raw, unapologetic truth had blindsided her. Marco Rubio did not move. His eyes held steady, scanning the stunned faces in the audience. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "Do you know what real shame is?" he asked. The host swallowed but said nothing. "Shame," Marco continued, "is growing up watching your father work late shifts as a bartender so his children could have a better life. It's seeing your mother clean houses so her kids could go to school. But despite their struggles, they never complained because this country gave them a chance." A tear slipped down a woman's cheek in the audience. "You sit here and call me a puppet for serving the country that gave my family everything." His voice cracked slightly, but he held firm. The host shifted uncomfortably. The moment was slipping from her control, but Marco Rubio was just getting started. The silence in the studio was no longer just silence, it was heavy, the kind that weighed down on people's chests. Marco leaned forward, his voice now commanding. filled with the weight of his story. I've never been a puppet. I've been a fighter. The audience felt his words. They weren't rehearsed. They weren't spun for political gain. They were real. You think I follow orders blindly? Number, I stand with President Trump because I believe in putting America first. I believe in keeping our country strong. But above all, I believe in never forgetting where we came from. The host opened her mouth, desperate to regain control of the conversation. But she had nothing. No witty remark. No sharp counter. She was drowning in the truth he had unleashed. Somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered, This is history. The world was watching, and Marco Rubio was rewriting the narrative before their eyes. By now, people across the country were on their feet, glued to their screens. A factory worker in Ohio wiped sweat from his brow, listening to Rubio's words. This man gets it, he muttered. A single mother in Texas, feeding her child at the dinner table, stopped mid-bite, her eyes glossy with tears. That's my story too, she whispered. On a military base overseas, a group of soldiers watched the interview in their break room. One of them, a tough Marine who had seen war, clenched his jaw. Finally, a leader who speaks for us. The host shifted in her seat. She had been in this industry for years, had taken down many politicians, but this wasn't a takedown, this was a reckoning. And Marco Rubio, he wasn't just speaking to her anymore. He was speaking to America. Marco Rubio looked into the camera. He wasn't just speaking to the host anymore. He was speaking to every American watching. You ask if I'm ashamed, he repeated, his voice steady but full of emotion. Number, I am honored, because I serve something bigger than any one man. I serve the American people. The host fidgeted. She had walked into this interview expecting to make headlines, but not like this. You sit there in your comfortable studio, Marco continued, and you throw words like puppet at me. But do you know what I see when I visit the families of fallen soldiers? Do you know what I hear when I sit with single mothers working 2 jobs? Or when I talk to immigrants who came here with nothing but hope? His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed forward. They don't care about media games. They don't care about labels. They care about one thing. Will their leaders fight for them? And that's exactly what I do. The audience erupted into applause. The host had lost control of the interview, but more importantly, she had lost the people. Across America, the impact of Rubio's words was spreading. In Miami, an elderly Cuban woman sat in her small apartment, clutching a framed photo of her late husband. He had fled communism, working long hours in factories so their children could have a future. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, Gracias, Marco. In a dimly lit diner in Pennsylvania, a waitress wiped her eyes before taking another order. She had grown up poor, working her way through school while raising her siblings. For the first time, she whispered, I feel like someone sees us. The host shifted in her seat, but Marco wasn't done. You want to talk about shame? He leaned forward. Shame is when politicians spend more time fighting each other than fixing the problems that everyday Americans face. The studio was dead silent. The host, usually quick-witted and sharp, was out of words. America was listening and America was feeling. The control room was in chaos. The producer frantically whispered into the host's earpiece, change the subject, end the interview. But she couldn't. Marco's words had ignited something deep inside the audience. People weren't just watching anymore. They were experiencing something real. You call me a puppet? Rubio continued. Then let me tell you what kind of puppet I am. I am a puppet of the hardworking Americans who don't have a voice in places like this. Tears streamed down faces in the audience. Even the camera crew, professionals trained to stay detached, blinked rapidly, swallowing back their own emotions. I serve the people. I fight for them. And I will never be ashamed of that. The host finally opened her mouth. But before she could speak, the crowd erupted not just claps, but a standing ovation. And in that moment, Marco Rubio didn't just win the interview, won America's heart. The host's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her pen. She had never lost control of an interview before, but now she was watching it slip right through her fingers. Marco Rubio sat still, his expression unwavering. His words had already carved through the noise, cutting straight to the heart of the people watching. Secretary Rubio. The host finally managed, her voice less sharp now. Aren't you just defending a man who... She paused, something in her throat catching. She looked around. The audience wasn't on her side anymore. The cold stares, the murmurs, they were all directed at her. For the first time in her career, she realized something. She wasn't the one in control. Marco leaned forward. If you have something to say, say it. But don't twist the truth to fit a headline. That's not journalism, that's entertainment. The studio gasped. The host's lips pressed together. She knew she had lost. Across the country, emotions ran high. A father in Texas, holding his newborn son, wiped a tear from his eye. This is the kind of leadership we need. In New York, an elderly war veteran, sitting in his wheelchair, saluted the screen. Finally, a man who speaks for us. Even in the homes of people who didn't always agree with Rubio, something had changed. They weren't watching a politician anymore. They were watching a human being. A man who stood by his convictions no matter what. The host, still shaken, cleared her throat. Do you really believe that serving under Trump makes you a hero? She asked, reaching for control again. Marco tilted his head. Being a hero isn't about who you work for, he said. It's about who you fight for. A single mother in California burst into tears. She understood. The interview had barely ended, but the world was already reacting. Social media exploded. Millions of tweets, comments, and posts flooded the internet. Marco Rubio's interview stuns America. People weren't just watching anymore, they were feeling. Inside the studio, the host turned to the control room. She was supposed to wrap up the interview, but something told her it was too late. The truth had already been spoken. Marco Rubio wasn't just another politician, he was a voice for the forgotten. And the world would never forget this moment. The studio was no longer just a place for an interview, it had become an arena. Marco Rubio sat firm, unwavering. He had walked into this room expecting tough questions, but he hadn't expected to speak to the soul of America. The host, still reeling from his previous words, attempted to compose herself. Let's be honest here, Secretary Rubio, she said, forcing a smile. People believe you're just defending the president because it's your job. Marco didn't hesitate. No, ma'am, he said, his voice calm but powerful. My job isn't to defend a man. My job is to defend a country that has given people like my parents, like millions of hardworking Americans, a chance. The room fell silent. You call me a puppet? But tell me, who am I supposed to be a puppet for? Marco asked, his voice steady. The elite? The people in Washington who have forgotten what real Americans go through every day? He let the question hang in the air. The host had no answer because everyone watching already knew it. The moment was bigger than just a debate. Across the nation, people sat glued to their screens. The streets were quieter. Restaurants had turned their TVs up. Even children sat beside their parents, watching history unfold. And then it happened. The host's voice trembled as she tried one last time. But don't you think serving Trump is dangerous? Marco let out a breath, then leaned in. Dangerous? He repeated. You want to talk about danger? Then let's talk about the father who kisses his children goodbye before going to work, hoping he'll make enough to keep the lights on. The mother who skips meals so her kids can eat. The young man who enlists in the military, not knowing if he'll come home. Tears welled up in eyes all over the studio. That's real danger. And that's exactly who I fight for. The host's face paled because this wasn't just about politics anymore. This was about people. The control room was frantic. We need to cut to commercial, a producer whispered into the earpiece. But it was too late. The moment had already happened. Marco Rubio turned to the camera. I serve the people, I don't apologize for that. And I will never, ever be ashamed of it. The audience, first silent, rose to their feet, a standing ovation. The host sat there, stunned. She wasn't the one who had been silenced. The entire country had been shaken. The internet exploded. Marco Rubio's interview goes viral. A moment that left a nation in tears. Millions shared the clip. People across America, people who had lost faith in politicians, in the system, in leadership, felt something they hadn't in years. Hope. And as the interview ended, Marco Rubio didn't look like just another Secretary of State. He looked like a leader. The standing ovation was deafening. Marco Rubio sat still, his expression firm but calm. The weight of his words still hung in the air. thick with emotion. The host, visibly shaken, struggled to maintain her composure.